There has been no hesitation to resort to force if the welfare of U.S. elites is threatened by what top-level planning documents describe as the threat of nationalistic regimes that are responsive to popular demands, I'm quoting, for improvement in the low living standards of the masses and production for domestic needs, and that seek to control their own resources. To counter such threats, the top-secret planning documents explain, the U.S. must encourage a political and economic climate conducive to private investment of both foreign and domestic capital. The means, it is frankly explained, must ultimately be force, because such policies somehow fail to gain much popular support and are constantly threatened by what are called subversive forces. If the media are to serve their societal purpose, such matters as these must be beyond the pale, remote from public awareness, and the massive evidence provided by the documentary record and evolving history must be consigned to dusty archives or marginal publications. We may speak in retrospect of blunders, misinterpretation, personal failings, even corruption and deceit on the part of leaders gone astray. But the study of institutions and how they function must be scrupulously ignored apart from fringe elements or a relatively obscure scholarly literature. These results have been quite satisfactorily achieved.
On Ideas Tonight, we're listening to excerpts from the 1988 Massey Lectures by Noam Chomsky. His topic is thought control in democratic societies.
Fabrication of necessary illusions for social management is as old as history. But in the democratic system, the necessary illusions cannot be imposed by force. Rather, they must be instilled in the public mind by more subtle means. A totalitarian state can be satisfied with lesser degrees of allegiance to required truths. It is sufficient that people obey. What they think is a secondary concern. But in a democratic political order, there's always the danger that an independent thought might be translated into political action. So it is important to eliminate the threat at its root. Debate cannot be stilled, and indeed it should not be stilled in a properly functioning system of propaganda. The reason is that it has a system-reinforcing character if it is constrained within proper bounds. What is essential is to set the bounds firmly. Controversy may rage as long as it adheres to the presuppositions that define the elite consensus, and it should furthermore be encouraged within these bounds. That helps to establish these doctrines as the very condition of thinkable thought, and it reinforces the belief that freedom reigns. One crucial doctrine, standard throughout history, is that the state is adopting a defensive stance, resisting challenges to order and to its noble principles. Thus, the United States is invariably resisting aggression, sometimes what's called internal aggression. Accordingly, it's a logical impossibility that anyone should oppose U.S. aggression. That's a category that cannot exist. Westerners have no problem in perceiving the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as brutal aggression, but the U.S. invasion of South Vietnam in the early 1960s cannot be perceived as such. True, U.S. forces were directly engaged in large-scale bombing and defoliation in an effort to drive the population into concentration camps where they could be, as we put it, protected from the enemy whom it was conceded they willingly support. True, a huge U.S. expeditionary force invaded and ravaged the country and later its neighbors with the explicit aim of destroying what was clearly recognized to be the only mass-based political force and eliminating the danger of political settlement that was sought on all sides. But throughout, we were resisting aggression in our yearning for democracy. Similarly, in the case of Central America today, the United States is defending freedom in what are called the fledgling democracies and restoring democracy to Nicaragua. There's no problem of ensuring democracy in the U.S.-backed terror states of Central America, firmly under military rule behind a thin civilian facade. We can assess the seriousness of the concern by turning to the results of a controlled experiment that history obligingly constructed. Just as the free press was consumed with rage over the aggressiveness of the violent communist totalitarians in Central America, with major stories and angry commentary, our client state of Israel launched another series of its periodic operations in Lebanon. The Israeli operations included bombing of Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanese towns and villages with large-scale destruction, dozens of people killed and many wounded, including many civilians. All of this was barely reported, and there was no noticeable reaction. The absence of comment or even serious reporting of the Israeli actions in Lebanon is perhaps understandable. These operations were, after all, rather muted by Israeli standards. They do not compare with the murderous Iron Fist operations in Lebanon in 1985, or the bombing of villages in the Bekaa Valley a year earlier, with 100 killed and 400 wounded, mostly civilians, including 150 children in a bombed-out schoolhouse in one raid. These were reported, but without affecting the elevated status of Israel. This tiny nation, symbol of human decency, as the editors of the New York Times described it, just at the height of the repression of the current Palestinian uprising, with beatings, killings, gassing, and collective punishment. Nicaragua, in contrast, is denied the right even to drive attacking forces out of its own territory. This is on the tacit assumption that no state has the right to defend itself from U.S. attack, another crucial doctrine that underlies responsible debate. I mentioned some of the ways of approaching the study of the media and evaluating models of media performance. One appropriate method is to consider the spectrum of opinion that is allowed expression. According to the propaganda model, one would expect the spectrum to be bounded by the elite consensus while encouraging tactical debate within it. Consider U.S. policy with regard to Nicaragua. That's probably elicited more controversy and impassioned rhetoric than any other single topic during the past several years. There is debate between the hawks on the one side and the doves on the other. The position of the hawks is expressed by a declaration of the State and Defense Departments on International Human Rights Day in December 1986. They asserted that in the American continent there is no regime more barbaric and bloody, no regime that violates human rights in a manner more constant and permanent than the Sandinista regime. Similar sentiments are widely voiced in the media and the political system, and it follows that we should support the democratic resistance to communist terror. At the other extreme, media doves observe that Mr. Reagan's policy of supporting the Contras is a clear failure, so we should acquiesce in some negotiated regional settlement that would be enforced by Nicaragua's neighbors. That's Tom Wicker of the New York Times. Expressing the same thought, the editors of the Washington Post see the Contras as an imperfect instrument, so we must find other means to fit Nicaragua back into a Central American mode and impose reasonable conduct by a regional standard. Notice that regional arrangements need not be imposed on our Salvadoran and Guatemalan friends, who have slaughtered perhaps 150,000 people during this period, or on our clients in Honduras, who kill fewer outright, but have left hundreds of thousands to starve to death while the country exports food for the profit of agribusiness. Their countries already conform to the Central American mode of repression, exploitation, and rule by privileged elements that accede to the demands of U.S. power, what we call democracy, so even hideous atrocities are of no account, and they merit aid and support, with occasional expressions of regret if the terror, torture, and mutilation become too visible to ignore. By 1986, the Contra option was opposed by 80% of American leaders, polls report. The propaganda model would therefore predict debate over Contra aid, but near unanimity in opposition to the Sandinistas. To test the hypothesis, consider the period of maximum intensity of debate over Nicaragua policy, the first 3 months of 1986, when attention was focused on the issue of Contra aid. During these months, the New York Times and the Washington Post, the two major national newspapers, they ran no less than 85 opinion columns on the matter. That includes their regular columnists. As expected, they were divided over Contra aid. But of the 85 columns, all 85 were critical of the Sandinistas, the vast majority harshly so. Thus, 100% conformity was achieved on the major issue.